Hi there, students. It's Mr. Ramage, and we are going to go through Amendments 11 through 27 from the United States Constitution. Remember, this is a very big part of what we need to know in preparation for your Ohio State test. This material and content covers five standards on the Ohio State test that you're going to be taking in April. So this is a really big chunk from last year and previous experience. If you know these amendments well, your score will pretty much turn out the way you want it to. So we're going to do a very quick review. We've covered all these in class, but let's hit them up one more time. I'm going to try to do each one in under a minute, which would still make this video over 17 minutes long. So some of them are going to go a little bit faster, so please reference your notes and any and all resources that we covered in class. So here we go. The 11th Amendment to the Constitution states that citizens cannot sue states. States are sovereign. They are essentially unsuable. So the 11th Amendment clarifies an issue based on the court case of Chisholm versus Georgia, where the Supreme Court ruled that a citizen could sue a state. This amendment essentially overturns that original decision by the court and states that citizens cannot sue a state. Number 12. After the tie between President-to-be Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr in the election of 1800, we have to clarify and rework how we vote for the president. So the 12th Amendment to the Constitution changes how the Electoral College votes for the president, creating a separate vote for the president and a separate vote for the vice president, preventing any future ties like what happened between Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Burr in 1800. Now, the next three amendments are all part of the aftermath of the American Civil War and part of the Reconstruction era. Make sure you know that term Reconstruction. It's super important. They will use it on the test as a way to connect to the history behind the amendments. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude. So since it's an amendment in the Constitution, no states can bring it back. And slavery is forever abolished, as well as involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment becomes a very important amendment because there were some questions concerning the legality of freed slaves and are they citizens and do they deserve the same rights as everybody else. So the 14th Amendment is going to squash all that debate about what to do with these newly freed people. And the 14th Amendment isn't just an amendment that applies to freed and emancipated slaves after the war. It applies to every single American, you, me, everybody else. And to get the 14th Amendment down to its most important parts, remember these five words: equal protection under the law. 14th Amendment guarantees all citizens of the United States, born or naturalized, equal protection under the law. This is the amendment that's used in almost every civil rights case and every civil rights issue that's been before the court or debated or anything really. So the 14th Amendment becomes the super most important amendment in the Constitution. 15th Amendment guarantees all men have the right to vote. So we're talking post-Civil War, Reconstruction. Black men were denied the right to vote. The 15th Amendment will ensure that all men above the age of 21, that'll be an amendment later, all men over the age of 21 are able to vote. So those are your 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Those are all part of the Reconstruction era, something you need to be familiar with because the test will talk about the historical circumstances surrounding these amendments. The next set of amendments are from the Progressive era, another historical chunk, a historical block of amendments. The 16th Amendment is going to create an income tax in the United States. This tax was a way to fund and support government services and programs, which the progressives wanted to see more of in order to fix and improve American society, especially in urban areas. 16th Amendment creates an income tax. 17th Amendment to the Constitution allows the citizens of each state to directly elect their state senators. Prior to this, it was the state legislatures that elected the state senators. This caused a lot of bribery and corruption and was an indirect way for people to have representation in Congress and the Senate. The 17th Amendment is going to do away with that process of the state legislatures electing the senators and put it in the hands of the voters of the states. So the 17th Amendment, direct election of state senators, 17 SE, senators SE. That's how I remember it. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution is all about the prohibition of alcohol. Progressives were concerned about fixing America's social problems, and they believed that alcohol was a key to that. So let's get rid of alcohol, and therefore we'll get rid of the problems. But the problem of prohibition is going to be a huge problem, which we'll have to solve later with another amendment. But the 18th Amendment creates prohibition in the United States, which makes the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcoholic beverages illegal. The 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. All women now have the right to vote. This was passed after World War I in 1920, women having to wait over 100 years to vote in the United States. Some western states like Wyoming, which was the first state to give women the right to vote, had already granted that right and privilege or power to women, but only at local and state level elections, not federal elections, so they couldn't vote for president or for their congresspeople. But the 19th Amendment clarifies that women have the right to vote in all elections, both state, local, and federal elections. So the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments are all part of the progressive era. Make sure you know that term and the historical time period that it involves. 20th Amendment deals with the inauguration of the president. So when the Constitution was written, the president was elected in November, just like they are now, but didn't take office until March the 4th. Due to slow travel and communication, they needed a longer period of time to get everything situated and ready to go. But by the time the 1930s rolls around, that's really no longer an issue. We've got trains, planes, automobiles. It's a good movie from the 80s, check it out. But in communication is faster with, obviously, the telephone, right? So there's no need to wait for that long of a period for the person to become president and also for Congress to begin their work. So that period of time is called a lame duck. So to eliminate that lame duck period, we're going to move the inauguration of the president up from March 4th to January 20th, and we're going to move the start of Congress's term to January the 3rd and get this government moving a little bit faster. So the 20th Amendment moves up the inauguration and the start of the government from March to January. The 21st Amendment goes back to the 18th Amendment, and the 21st Amendment is going to repeal the 18th Amendment, and it's going to end prohibition. Yay! Prohibition was wildly unpopular, wildly unsuccessful, and it was a complete and total disaster. But because it was an amendment of the Constitution, you have to make a whole new amendment to get rid of the previous amendment. Make sure you know the term repeal. Very important that you know that term. It will be used on the test. The 21st Amendment repeals the 18th Amendment. The 22nd Amendment deals with the amount of terms that the president can serve and be elected to. So when Washington was president, he served 2 terms, but there was nothing written down that said he could only serve 2 terms. It was just what he chose to do. So Washington set the precedent, not president, precedent of only serving 2 terms, and that carried through all the way until Franklin Roosevelt, who was elected to 4 terms as president in 1932, 1930, let me do my math here, 32, 36, 1940, and 1944. He died the first year into his 4th term, but he was president for 13 years and elected to 4 terms. So following that, the conversation began, well, should we do something about that? Should we limit those terms? Probably a good idea. So the 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms in office, a total of 8 years potentially, depending on unique circumstances. Okay, 22, 2 terms. 22, 2 terms. The 23rd Amendment to the Constitution is going to give the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., electoral votes in the election of the president. So Washington, D.C. does not exist within a state. It's its own district, but therefore had no electoral votes for the election of the president. Really long, complicated story about why that is. We're going to keep it really simple. Not that many chances you're going to see this question specifically on the graduation test. You may see it pop up within another question, usually talking about like unique historical circumstances. I think that's the terminology they use. But you do need to know that the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution gave 3 electoral votes to Washington, D.C. D.C. gets 3. That's how I remember it. D.C. gets 3, and that's number 23. Lots of 3s flying around. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution is going to deal with a problem that was created after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave all men the right to vote, specifically black males in the South after the Civil War. Many states in the South implemented poll taxes, which was a tax that you had to pay in order to vote. The tax specifically targeted African Americans who were, of course, making lower wages than white workers and white farmers, many of them sharecropping and living in a lot of poverty. Having to pay a tax to vote limited the ability of those people to go out and vote. If you have to make a choice between feeding your family and voting, chances are you're going to pick feeding your family. Poll taxes also impacted poor whites as well, but at a much smaller level. But poll taxes made voting in America extraordinarily difficult and limited the freedom and opportunity of African American citizens and other poor citizens to make real changes in their community. This was a very big part of the Civil Rights Movement, and in the 1960s, specifically 1964, the 24th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified and approved, abolishing poll taxes. So the 24th Amendment abolishes all poll taxes in the United States. The 25th Amendment happened after the assassination of President Kennedy, and some questions came up about what do we do if the president dies or can't fulfill his duties or responsibilities or is removed from office? What happens if the vice president dies? We just need to know what the protocol is going to be. So following President Kennedy's assassination in '63 and questions about then Vice President and now President Lyndon Johnson's health, the 25th Amendment was written and ratified. And what the 25th Amendment does is it just clarifies the order of succession to the presidency. What happens if the president dies or is removed from office or resigns from office? What happens if the vice president dies, resigns, or removes from office? Who takes over? What if the president can't perform his duties? Who does power fall to? That's what the 25th Amendment basically solves. So it clarifies what happens if the president or the vice president are not able to serve in office. The 26th Amendment to the Constitution is another of the voting amendments. So we talked earlier about people who were able to vote had to be 21. So in the 1960s, we have the Vietnam War. We've got the draft. Young men are being drafted into the armed forces to go off and fight in Vietnam, and they can be drafted if they're 18 or older. Well, if they're 18, they can't vote. 19, 20, they can't vote. You can only vote if they're 21. So they're fighting in a war that they really have no voice or vote to impact. They're being drafted by a government that they don't have a voice in electing or selecting. So there was a big push to lower the voting age from 21 down to 18, and that's what the 26th Amendment is going to do. It's actually the fastest amendment that was ever ratified over the course of about March, April, May, June, July, about 5 months. Okay, so the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. And then the last one is the 27th Amendment, the most recent amendment that was added to the Constitution. This is super boring and really not important. You're not really going to see much about it, but we do need to know it, of course, because you never know what's going to be on that test. The 27th Amendment to the Constitution was added in the 1990s as Congress cannot give itself a raise. So Congress votes to determine how much money its members are paid. It's like, going up to your boss and telling your boss what your raise is going to be. Congress cannot vote itself a raise in its current term. So if the term's going to last another 2 years, we can vote for the raise then, but it's not going to go into effect until the next Congress meets. And then the raise would go into effect, and some of those members of Congress wouldn't be there anymore. So Congress cannot vote itself a raise. So that's Amendments 11 through 27. Very quick summary. We've gone over them in class. You've got lots of resources on them. But you really do need to know those amendments really ice cold. You need to know the history that surrounds those amendments, so you need to be familiar with some of the circumstances. You definitely need to be familiar with the vocabulary. The biggest amendments that we're going to see on the state graduation test in April deal with the suffrage amendments. Any amendment that deals with the right to vote, you are going to see. You have got to know those cold. Okay, so that would be the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the 24th Amendment, and the 26th Amendment. And we'll continue to practice those. Okay, so that's your quick review of the amendments. Hopefully you're going to have them ice cold by your benchmark assessment and super freezing ice cold by your state graduation test.